The church was packed. 400 guests dressed in pearl whites and champagne silks sat shoulder to shoulder beneath crystal chandeliers that threw golden light across every face. Flowers lined the aisle, white roses shipped from Italy, lilies arranged by hand, candles burning in perfect formation. It was the kind of wedding that looked like it had been cut from the pages of a magazine and placed gently into real life. And standing at that altar, in a dress that had cost her 3 years of savings, was Elara Voss. She was 28 years old. She was trembling, not from nerves, but because she had spent the last hour watching the doors at the back of the church while her hands turned cold inside her white satin gloves. Everyone could see it. The maid of honor noticed. The flower girl noticed. Even the priest, who had married hundreds of couples in this very room, noticed. But no one said a word. Because in the front row of the groom's side sat a man who made people lose their words. A man who made grown men straighten their backs when he walked into a room. A man who had not been invited. And yet, here he was, seated like he had always belonged there. One leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey already in his hand, though the bar wasn't open yet. His name was Dante Caruso, and there was not a soul in this city who didn't know what that name meant. But we'll come back to him. Because right now, the bride was still standing at the altar, and the groom had not yet arrived. The pianist had looped the same piece of music 3 times. The priest was checking his watch. Elara's mother, seated in the 3rd row with tears already threatening to streak her powder, reached across and gripped the arm of the woman sitting beside her. "He's coming," she whispered. "He's just late." But Elara knew. She knew because she had found the ticket stub 2 weeks ago. A flight to Lisbon, booked in her fiancé's name, departure date set for the morning after this wedding. She had told herself it was a surprise honeymoon. She had folded the stub and placed it back in the drawer and smiled at herself in the mirror and said, "He loves you. He loves you. He loves you." She had needed very badly to believe that. The church doors opened, and Daniel Vance, tall, handsome, the kind of man who had told Elara she was the only woman he had ever truly seen, walked down the aisle with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on some invisible point above her head. He stopped beside her. He did not take her hands. The pianist stopped playing. The priest looked between them with the quiet alarm of a man who knew a storm was coming, but had no umbrella. And in the silence, with 400 people watching, Daniel Vance turned his head and looked at his bride, really looked at her, for what felt like the last time. "I can't do this," he said. The words were quiet, but in a stone church with perfect acoustics, they reached every corner. Elara didn't move. "Elara!" His voice cracked on her name like he was trying to sound remorseful and discovering he wasn't capable of it. "I'm sorry. I can't marry you. I've been trying to tell you for months. I'm sorry." A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Elara's mother made a sound that was not quite a word. And Elara, quiet, steady, humiliated in front of everyone she had ever known, stood with her hands at her sides, in a dress she had paid for with 3 years of her life, and she did not cry. She didn't speak either. She just looked at the man in front of her and understood something she had been refusing to understand for a very long time. Daniel was already stepping backward, already moving towards the aisle, already choosing himself over the woman he had promised to love. And that was when the man in the front row stood up. Dante Caruso rose from his seat like a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment. He was 36 years old, though people always mistook him for older, not because he looked worn, but because he carried the kind of weight in his eyes that most people spent a lifetime accumulating. He was broad-shouldered in a black suit that fit like it had been made for him that morning, and his dark hair was swept back from a face that was striking in the way that wolves are striking, beautiful, and completely without mercy. He was not supposed to be at this wedding. He had not been invited. He had arrived an hour before the ceremony began, spoken 4 words to the security team at the entrance, and been shown to a seat in the front row. Nobody had questioned it. When Dante Caruso decided he was somewhere, he was there. Now he stood in the aisle, and Daniel Vance, who had been moving toward that aisle with the confidence of a man who had already made his escape, stopped walking. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Dante's voice was low and almost conversational, the way very dangerous things often are before they stop being conversational. Then he looked at Daniel the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has fallen off a truck and landed in the road. Inconvenient, messy, easy enough to step around. Daniel straightened. "This is a private matter." "You walked out on a woman in front of 400 people, Dante said. "That's not private. That's a performance." He glanced at Daniel's shoes, expensive, polished, pointing towards the door. Then he looked back up, and something in his expression had gone very still. Like, "Keep walking." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He walked, the doors closed behind him, and Dante Caruso turned and looked at Elara. She was still standing at the altar, still in the dress, still not crying. Her chin was lifted exactly 1 degree higher than it had been when Daniel left, which was the only evidence that she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. The priest opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The 400 guests were frozen. Dante walked down the aisle toward the altar with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything. He stopped at the foot of the altar steps. He looked up at her, and in a voice pitched for her and not for the crowd, though the crowd heard it perfectly, he said, "Then she's mine." The silence in that church became something physical. Elara stared at him. She had never met this man. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone knew who Dante Caruso was. You didn't live in the city and not know the name. But knowing a name and having that name spoken at your abandoned altar were 2 entirely different experiences. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Not yet," he held out his hand. "But you're not leaving this church humiliated, and you're not standing there alone." A pause. "Unless you want to." Elara looked at the hand, looked at the crowd watching her from every angle, looked at the priest, who had taken a careful step backward. She looked back at Dante. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "The right thing," he said. "Probably for the first time in my life." She didn't take his hand that day. What she did was lift the front of her dress, walk down the altar steps without looking at a single guest, and exit through the side door of the church alone. She got into a cab. She went home. She sat on her kitchen floor in her wedding dress for an hour and a half before she took it off. Dante Caruso did not follow her. He went back to his seat, finished his whiskey, and left the church without speaking to anyone. But 2 days later, there was a car outside her apartment building. Not obviously his, a dark sedan, nothing conspicuous, But she noticed it because she noticed everything. She was the kind of woman who had trained herself to notice things, because the alternative was being surprised by them. She went down and knocked on the window. The driver lowered it, handed her an envelope without a word. Inside was a card with a single line written in handwriting, so precise it looked almost printed. You left before I could ask properly. Dinner, Thursday. DC Elara turned the card over in her hands. She knew what the initials meant. She knew that accepting dinner with Dante Caruso was not the kind of decision that came without consequences. She knew that his world was not her world, and that his world ate people like her for sport. She went to dinner on Thursday. She told herself it was because she was tired of being afraid of things. The restaurant he chose was the kind of place that didn't have a sign outside, where the maître d' knew your face before you gave your name, where the other diners didn't stare, not because they weren't curious, but because in places like this, staring was a social crime. Dante was already seated when she arrived. He stood when she walked in, which surprised her, because she had expected many things from this man, and good manners had not been one of them. You came, he said. You sent a car every day for 2 days, she said, sitting across from him. I assumed the alternative was worse. The corner of his mouth did something that was almost a smile. It wasn't a threat. I know. She met his eyes. That's why I came. What happened over the next 3 hours was not what either of them expected. He didn't perform. He didn't intimidate. He asked her questions, real questions, the kind that required actual answers. And he listened to the answers with an attention that was almost unsettling because it was so complete. He wanted to know who she was, not what she did, not where she'd gone to school, not what had happened at the altar, who she was. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told Daniel in 4 years. She told him about her father, who had disappeared when she was 9, about the years she had spent trying to be small enough that her mother wouldn't notice the extra cost of her existence, about the scholarship she'd won to study music at 17, the one she'd turned down because her mother needed the income she'd been generating from her part-time jobs, about the day she decided she was done being small. Dante listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Why did you really come to dinner, he asked. I told you, you're not afraid of the alternative, he said. You're not afraid of much. So why? Elara looked at him. Because you were the only person in that church who looked at me like I was still standing, she said. Something shifted in his face. Something he buried quickly, but not quickly enough. Over the following weeks, Dante Caruso inserted himself into her life with the same quiet, unstoppable efficiency with which he did everything else. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask permission. He was simply there, a car when she needed one, a problem solved before she knew it was a problem, and occasionally a presence at her kitchen table at 7 in the morning, drinking her coffee and reading her newspaper like he had always lived there. His men were confused. His associates were confused. His rivals were intrigued in ways that were dangerous for her. His second-in-command, Marco, pulled him aside 3 weeks in. She's a nobody, Marco said. Not cruelly, just factually, in the way Marco said most things. A music teacher from the East Side. Her ex left her at the altar because he was sleeping with the daughter of a city councilman. She has $1,700 in her bank account and an apartment with a broken radiator. I know, Dante said. She's not a nobody? Dante turned to look at his second-in-command, and something in his eyes ended the sentence. She's the most... He stopped, started again. Fix her radiator. Marco stared at him. Now, Dante said. Marco fixed the radiator. But not everyone in Dante's world was as easy to redirect, because 3 weeks after the wedding, a rumor had started moving through certain circles. A rumor that said Dante Caruso had taken a personal interest in a woman. And in Dante's world, personal interests were weaknesses, and weaknesses were opportunities. Elara didn't know any of this. She was too busy noticing that she was, against every reasonable expectation, beginning to feel something. It was on a Wednesday evening that things changed. Elara was teaching a late lesson. A 12-year-old boy named Felix, who had no natural talent but extraordinary determination, which in her private opinion was the more valuable of the two. She was walking him through a particularly stubborn passage of Mozart when 2 men appeared outside the window of her ground-floor studio. They didn't knock. One of them opened the door. She had not locked it. She never locked it, and stepped inside with the practiced ease of a man who opened doors that weren't his to open. Elara Voss, the man said. Not a question. Felix stopped playing. Lesson's over for today, the man said to the boy. His tone was pleasant, which made it worse. Elara stood. Felix, please wait outside. She kept her voice even. Felix looked between her and the men, and she met his eyes and nodded once. He gathered his music and left. The 2 men shut the door. Dante Caruso's been spending a lot of time near you, the first man said. He was well-dressed, older, with the kind of face that suggested money earned through ways that didn't bear examination. We thought it would be worth having a conversation. About what? Elara asked. About whether you might be willing to pass along certain information. Schedules, locations, who visits him, when, for how long. He smiled. Small things, easy things, well compensated. The room was very quiet. Elara looked at him steadily for a long moment, and then she said, Get out of my studio. The man's smile didn't move. Miss Voss, you have until I count to 3, she said. Then I pick up that piano bench and I put it through that window, and you can explain to the police what you were doing here. A pause. 1, she said. Something in her voice, something ancient and completely unbothered, made the man's smile falter. They left. She called Dante. He arrived in 11 minutes, which meant he had already been nearby, which she had questions about, but set aside for later. He came inside and looked around the empty studio with the careful attention of a man cataloging what had happened there. Did they touch you? He asked. No. Did they threaten you directly? No. What did they want? She told him. He listened without his expression changing, which she had come to understand was a sign that he was most serious. When she finished, he nodded once and pulled out his phone. I'll handle it, he said. I know. She looked at him. But I want to know why they came to me. Specifically. I want to know what you're not telling me. Dante lowered his phone. For a long moment, he looked at her with something in his expression that she could not quite name. Because being near me makes you a target, he said, which means I need to tell you something. And I need you to understand that I've been trying to figure out how. Elara sat on the piano bench. Then sit down, she said, and tell me. He sat. He was quiet for a moment in the way that men are quiet when they are organizing not just words, but consequences. Your father, he said, Alessandro Voss. Elara's breath changed almost imperceptibly. He didn't disappear, Dante said. He left. Specifically, he left because he was in debt. Not to a bank, to my father. A pause. My father was not a patient man. Elara looked at him. Alessandro Voss borrowed money, a large amount. He made promises he couldn't keep. When my father came to collect, Alessandro ran, left his wife, left his daughter, disappeared into a life that didn't involve us. My mother told me he was dead, Elara said quietly. Your mother didn't know what had happened. She thought he'd simply abandoned you. Dante's voice was careful. Careful in a way that cost him something. She was partly right. And you knew this? I found out the day after the wedding, he said, when I had you looked into. Elara was very still. You had me looked into, she said. I always do. So when you stood up in that church, I didn't know then. I found out after. He met her eyes. I'm telling you now. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind. Where is he? She asked. My father. Dante was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. Dante! Her voice was low and clear and entirely without trembling. He came back, Dante said. 3 years ago. He came back to the city. He tracked down my family to try to repay the debt. It had grown considerably by then. And he offered something instead of money. What? Information. On a rival of mine. Dante's jaw was tight. He worked for me. Briefly. He was useful. Was, she said. He was killed, Dante said. 14 months ago. Oh, not by me. By the people whose operations he'd helped me disrupt. A pause. I didn't know he had a daughter until 2 days after I met you. The room was very quiet. Elara looked down at her hands in her lap, then back at him. And then you kept coming around anyway, she said. Yes. Why? Dante was quiet. And then, in a voice she had never heard from him before, stripped of the careful architecture of a man who never admitted to wanting things. Because you're the first person in 15 years who's looked at me without calculating what I'm worth to them. Elara absorbed this. You owe me, she said finally. He nodded, once, slowly. I know. Not money, she said. Not protection, not cars outside my building. She looked at him. The truth. All of it. Everything about my father. What he did. Who he was. How he ended. I want to know who he was. Dante looked at her for a long time. That will take more than one night, he said. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. What neither of them knew was that the men who had visited her studio had already passed her name upward. They belonged to a man named Victor Seld, a figure who operated in the gray edges of Dante's territory, always careful enough to avoid direct confrontation, always close enough to be a permanent irritation. Victor had been watching Dante for years, cataloging weaknesses and finding none. Men like Dante Caruso didn't have personal lives. They had associates and assets and occasional distractions. But this was different. Victor's informants had watched Dante restructure his schedule around her, cancel meetings for her, arrive at a music studio in the East Side looking, for the first time in his adult life, like he was somewhere he actually wanted to be. Victor understood immediately what this meant. The woman wasn't an asset or a diversion. She was an anchor. And anchors, in their world, were the most dangerous thing you could hand to an enemy. he began to move pieces. Elara felt none of this. She was living through the strangest chapter of her life. The man who had claimed her at the altar turning out to be both less monstrous and more complicated than she had expected. She knew what he was. She didn't pretend otherwise. But she had also watched him send 3 months of groceries to an elderly woman on her block after noticing once that Elara had mentioned the woman couldn't climb stairs easily anymore. She had watched him sit across from her kitchen table in silence for 2 hours while she prepared a lesson plan and not demand anything from that silence. She had watched him pause once outside a children's music school, looking at the window display with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person looking at a life they had been walking parallel to without ever being allowed inside. She had asked him once if he'd played an instrument. "Piano," he said, "when I was 8, until my father decided it was the wrong kind of ambition." She had sat down at her kitchen upright and played him 3 bars of the piece she'd been teaching Felix. His hands, she noticed, had moved almost invisibly on the edge of the table, following the notes from memory. She did not comment on this, but she remembered it. It was on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the studio incident, that Marco arrived at her apartment without warning. He was a large man with a face that had clearly been rearranged at some point in the past, and he stood in her doorway looking profoundly uncomfortable. "He's been arrested," Marco said without preamble. Elara stared. Arrested. "Held for questioning. Routine, happens occasionally. He'll be released within 48 hours. But while he's unavailable, there are people who'll move." "Move how?" Marco's jaw shifted. "Miss Voss, I need you to go somewhere safe for the next 48 hours. "Define safe." "We have a property." "I'm not going to one of his properties while he's being questioned by the police," Elara said flatly. "That's insane." Marco looked at her. "Then I'll stay here." "You absolutely will not, Miss Voss." Marco's voice did something she had not heard it do before. It went quiet, almost human. "He asked me to make sure you were safe. That's the only thing he asked for when they took him in." "One thing." He paused. "I've worked for this man for 11 years. He's never asked for one thing when they take him in." The apartment was quiet. Elara looked at Marco. "Fine," she said. "You can sit in the hallway." Marco sat in the hallway. Dante was released in 31 hours. He came to her apartment directly from the police station, still wearing yesterday's shirt, looking like a man who had spent the night being interrogated and had found it somewhat tedious. He knocked on her door. She opened it. She looked at him for a moment, then she stepped aside to let him in, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. He sat at her kitchen table. She put tea in front of him, not coffee, though he always drank coffee, because she had noticed once that he drank coffee when he needed to perform and made no remark about it when she put tea in its place. He wrapped his hands around the mug. "Thank you," he said. "For the tea?" "For not running." She sat across from him. "People keep underestimating how much it takes to make me run." He looked at her over the rim of the mug. And then he said, "I found something in your father's file that I didn't tell you." She waited. "He had been sending money," Dante said, "Mom, before he died. For 2 years, small amounts, routed through several layers, to an account in your mother's name." Elara was very still. "She never told me." She might not have known where it came from. It came through clean channels. It would have looked like a pension correction, Something bureaucratic. A pause. He was trying to take care of you both, in the only way he had left. Elara looked at the table. He wasn't a good man, Dante said. I want to be honest with you about that. He made terrible choices. He put you and your mother in a position that cost you years. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. But he was trying at the end, for whatever that's worth. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked for the truth, he said. All of it. She looked up at him. Why does it matter to you, she asked. Truly. Not the version you tell yourself. Why? He was quiet for a very long time. Because my father never tried, Dante said at last. He never tried to fix anything. He broke things and left them and decided that was simply the cost of doing business. He looked at his hands around the mug. I've spent a long time being his son. I'm trying to figure out whether that's all I am. The kitchen was very quiet. You sat down at my piano, Elara said softly. He looked at her. That first night, when you came after the men in my studio, you were standing by the piano when you called Marco. And your free hand, you were playing something on the fallboard, not randomly, something specific. He said nothing. What was it? A long beat. The piece you played me, he said. The Mozart. Elara absorbed this. You remembered it in one hearing, she said. Yes. That's not a small thing. No. She stood, went to the piano, and lifted the lid. Sat down, and played the passage, the same 3 bars she had played him weeks ago, slowly, and then again. She slid to one side of the bench. He looked at the space she'd left. You remember it, she said. Sit down. The longest pause she had ever witnessed from a man who spent his life making split-second decisions. He sat down beside her on the bench. She placed his right hand on the keys and guided him through the passage. His hands remembered, imperfectly, after nearly 3 decades, but they remembered. The muscle memory of an 8-year-old who had loved something before someone decided love was the wrong kind of ambition. When the passage ended, neither of them moved. The attack came the following Sunday. Victor Seld had apparently decided that 48 hours was long enough to plan something, and that Dante's recent rearrest had created sufficient disruption. His men moved on the apartment building, not with overt violence, which would have been too traceable, but with the kind of quiet, targeted intention that was harder to explain afterward. What they had not accounted for was Marco, who had been sleeping in his car on the street since Thursday because nobody had told him to stop. And they had not accounted for Elara. She heard the sound in the hallway, the particular silence that comes after normal sounds stop, and she was out of bed and at the kitchen drawer in 4 seconds. She had 2 things in that drawer that she had never mentioned to anyone: a phone with a single contact in it, and a small device that Marco had left with her on the first night and instructed her to activate if she ever felt unsafe. She activated it. Then she picked up the phone. The contact's name in the phone was simply a question mark. She pressed call. It answered on the first ring. A voice she did not recognize, older. Careful. Miss Voss, the voice said. Not surprised. There are people in my building, she said quietly. Marco's outside. We know, the voice said. Stay on the line. Marco has already called it in. Do not open any doors. Who is this? She asked. A pause. Someone who's been watching this situation develop, the voice said, with considerable interest. That's not an answer. No, the voice agreed. It isn't. But here is one. The phone you're holding belonged to your father. He gave it to Dante 4 years ago and told him to use it only for emergencies. Dante put it in your kitchen drawer 3 weeks ago without telling you, because he wanted you to have a way out that didn't go through him. The hallway outside had gone completely quiet. He's been protecting me without me knowing, Elara said. For longer than you realize, the voice said. Miss Voss, your father came to Dante's father to repay a debt. But the reason he had taken on that debt in the first place was to pay for your mother's medical treatment. 14 years ago. A surgery she needed and couldn't afford. Elara's breath stopped. He left, she said. He left to protect us from what he owed. He left because staying was going to cost you more than leaving did. He wasn't a good man. But that particular choice, a pause, was made for you. The sound of rapid movement outside. Then Marco's voice in the hallway, low and controlled, and the sound of something that resolved itself quickly. Then silence. Then a knock at her door. It's over, Marco said through the door. You can open it. She opened the door. Marco stood in the hallway with a slight cut above his eyebrow and the expression of a man who had handled the situation and found it simpler than expected. He's on his way, Marco said. I know, she said. Dante arrived at her building at 2 a.m. He came through the door and she was sitting on the kitchen floor. Not in distress, she had long graduated from that, but because the kitchen floor was where she went when she needed to think close to the ground. He came and sat on the floor across from her, his back against the counter, and they looked at each other across 3 feet of cold tile. The phone, she said. Yes. How long have you known about the surgery? He was quiet. Since the night I had you looked into, he said. The day after the wedding. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know how to tell you without telling you everything else. And everything else, he stopped. Everything else meant telling you that my family is the reason your father's life fell apart. That the man who stood up at your altar and said you were his is the son of the man who put a price on your father's head. He looked at the floor between them. I knew that if you knew, you would walk away. And he stopped again. Say it, she said. I didn't want you to walk away. The words cost him something enormous. She could see the price of them in the set of his jaw. That was selfish. I know it was selfish. Elara looked at him. My father's debt, she said. Does it transfer? No. Are you sure? I canceled it, he said. The night I found out. Retroactively. As of 14 years ago, there was never a debt. She absorbed this. That's not something you can actually do. No, he agreed. It's not. But I have the records, and the records say what I need them to say. Dante, he looked at her. You canceled a debt to a dead man, she said. For me. For you, he said. And because it was right. A pause. Those two things aren't always the same thing. This time they were. The kitchen was very quiet. She reached across the tile floor between them and took his hand. He looked at their hands, then at her. I don't know how to be in someone's life, he said, without the way I know how to be in things. The control, the protection that looks like possession. I don't know how to... I know, she said. I'm not a good man. I know that too. Then why? Because you sat down on a piano bench, she said simply. Because you canceled a debt to a dead man. Because you put a phone in my drawer and didn't tell me, which was the wrong decision. I want to be clear about that. But the reason behind it was not control. It was care. She looked at him. I know the difference. He was quiet for a very long time. My father said that sentiment was a liability, Dante said at last. Your father sounds like he was deeply unhappy, Elara said. Something in his face shifted, cracked slightly, in the way that old stone cracks, not all at once, but in the fine lines that mean the structure is finally, slowly, releasing. Yes, he said. He was. They sat on the kitchen floor in silence for a while. Outside, Marco sat in his car and pretended not to notice the light in the kitchen window. 6 months after Daniel Vance walked out of a church in front of 400 people, Elara Voss stood on a rooftop at sunset with a man who had never once, in all the time she had known him, pretended to be something he wasn't. He had not proposed. That was not the kind of thing that happened in one clear dramatic moment with this man. What had happened instead was an accumulation of mornings, of kitchen tables, of piano passages practiced in the early hours when neither of them could sleep, of conversations that started at midnight and ended at dawn, of a man who had spent his entire life calculating exits, slowly, visibly, discovering that there was something he didn't want to exit from, of a woman who had spent her entire life being left by people she loved, slowly, visibly, discovering that she wasn't leaving this one. Eli Tisanai Tuyuan. Victor Seld had been dealt with, in the particular quiet way that problems in Dante's world were dealt with, which Elara did not ask specific questions about, and Dante did not volunteer specific answers to. The détente between them on that subject was both clear and tacit. Daniel Vance had moved to Lisbon. Nobody missed him. Felix, the 12-year-old with no talent and extraordinary determination, had, against all reasonable expectation, learned to play the difficult Mozart passage. Elara had called Dante the night it happened and played it for him through the phone. He had been in the middle of a meeting that had required 3 days of preparation. He had told the 3 men across the table from him to wait, and he had listened to the whole passage, and then he had said, "Tell him well done." On the rooftop at sunset, Elara was watching the city shift from gold to blue when Dante came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "I spoke to someone today," he said, "about a particular piece of property. On the east side." She looked at him. "There's a building available, street-level space, appropriate for a school." He kept his eyes on the city. A real school. Not one room and a studio piano. A real one. For kids who can't afford lessons. Elara was very still. "Dante, it could use a director," he said. "Someone who understands that talent is rarer than determination and that both are worth developing." A pause. "The building's already bought. The question was whether the right person would want it." She turned to look at him fully. He was still looking at the city, but his jaw was set the way it always was when he was waiting for something that mattered. "You bought a music school," she said. "I made an investment in a music school. In something that matters to you," he said. "Which makes it—" He stopped. She watched him struggle with the sentence. The man who had never had trouble finishing sentences in his life, standing on a rooftop at sunset, unable to complete a thought because the thought was too honest, and honest things had always cost him the most. "Which makes it matter to me," he finished quietly. Elara looked at him for a long time. Then she turned back to the city and stood beside him in the evening light and said, "We should probably talk about the piano at the entrance." "What about it?" Concert grand, nothing smaller. A pause. Done, he said. And for the first time since she had known him, or perhaps for the first time since he was 8 years old and someone had decided that his particular kind of ambition was wrong, Dante Caruso smiled. Not the half-smile, not the edge of amusement he wore in rooms where smiling was information. A real one. She didn't comment on it, but she saw it, and she kept it. Because the world is full of people who leave, and every once in a while, if you're standing at the right altar, i.e. at the right terrible moment, someone walks toward you instead. And that changes everything. If this story reached something in you, if you felt every moment of Elara standing at that altar, every second of Dante discovering that he was more than what his father made him, every quiet turn towards something worth staying for, then you are exactly who this channel is for. We tell stories here, not summaries, not outlines, stories that feel like movies, like something you'd stay up until 3 in the morning finishing because the characters won't let you go. Every week, a new story. Every story, a world. Hit the subscribe button right now so you never miss one. And if you want more stories like this one, powerful women who don't flinch, complicated men discovering their own humanity, secrets that rewrite everything, tap the notification bell so the next story finds you the moment it drops. And if this one moved you, if it sat with you in the way good stories do, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next story. The altar is never really the end. It's just where the real story begins.